In this video, we'll be covering the basic overview of the data correction environment. We'll also be covering the input ports and how they're represented within the data correction toolbox. So let's begin with the first kind of thing on the list, which is the input ports. Now we've got several input ports, and one of them is actually a slightly different color. So let's talk about those. The first one being the target signal. So the first one is basically where we will be applying all of our changes and corrections and flags and so on and so forth to that signal. So anything that we plug into the target, the top port, is where we can basically make changes and save to the output port. We also have surrogate signals. So in this case we have two surrogate signals that are plugged in, and again we kind of increase those surrogate input ports by going to the properties pane and changing the time series surrogate inputs. And below that we've got the discrete samples input port. So basically those purple triangles, we can basically bring them in and overlay them on top of our target and then use them as kind of reference points when it comes to making and applying corrections. Then finally below that we've got our rating measurements input port. Notice that that's kind of a light blue color, and that's basically for when we build rating curves and we want to kind of apply corrections on our water or stage data. We can overlay them on top and view them. So for example, I can open this up. We can see our rating measurements plotted here, got our date and time associated with it, and it's also in the grid view format as well under the measurements tab, and they're basically plotted for when we want to apply those corrections. We can basically view them on the same chart. Okay, so let's start off with the actual environment of the data correction toolbox. So we've got several panes here. Let's talk about those. On the left we have the correction control pane. So this is basically where we will be able to fine-tune our signal. So we can basically go through and say this is our start point and end point. It only basically populates once you mark that region. So right now it's kind of grayed out and not available, but the moment you kind of mark that region, it appears and populates. Below that we've got our snap to. So basically we can snap to any of those input ports that we've got plugged in. So we just need to make sure that checkbox is on. And then below that we've got our action. So we've got all of these different correction actions that we can apply. Anything from a drift correction to a clock drift, and also the ability to apply flags and grades and so on as well. So we can select it from that drop down menu. And then we have our actual target signal itself in the top port. So basically the top pane is the target signal where we can apply those changes and corrections, and we've also got our grab samples in this example, and that's overlaid on top of our signal, so we can basically use those as reference points. And below that we've got our surrogate signals, so both of those surrogates that are plugged in, we can see them both here, and as we've locked the x-axis together, as I zoom in to sections, you can see that for both of those periods, for the target and the surrogates are showing. On the right hand side we've got our time series grid, and they've kind of been filtered out so that we can go through and see what's going on in each tab. So this is our target time series that's basically listed from the entire length and breadth of that target signal. Then we have our discrete samples, so all of the discretes that are coming, that have been kind of imported and plugged in, they're listed, and rating measurements too. So if we've got any rating measurements, they would be listed here. And finally, any data gaps. So we've kind of covered in a subsequent video what a gap is and what an empty value is, so all of those will be listed here, and we can right click and fill those gaps. Okay, there's many buttons and features within this toolbox. I'm not going to cover all of them. One of the main important ones to kind of note is this one here, the auto scale y-axis on and off switch. It's very important when it comes to zooming in vertically, so you'll notice that once that's switched on, we won't be able to zoom in vertically, so remember to switch that off if you do want to zoom in vertically. And the other kind of common question asked on a daily basis is, how do I kind of switch on those flags that I've set? Don't forget to switch them on using the show hide flags. And finally, one of the really kind of neat features that we have is the ability to put our surrogates in with the target. So when it comes to kind of viewing them side by side, it makes life a lot easier. So we can do that by basically going to show hide signals and going to the target chart and adding and removing the surrogates. So we can either switch on both or just the one of them. So I can switch on both in this example. We can scale them both to the target, so it again makes life easier. So then they both appear in the target. And finally, we don't necessarily need to see it in the surrogate pane at the bottom, so we can go in there and switch that pane off. So that's basically the overview of the data correction toolbox. And in subsequent videos we'll be talking about how to apply corrections and delving further into the data correction toolbox.